I think that we can start our last session. So today we are going to have just very interesting. I'm have no hesitation that will be extremely interesting as always, because Dennis has many things to tell us about his research, and is very much interested in the topic that is the main central part of our summer school, about institutions. So he's going to present today his research. That will be the last session of this central part of our summer school, because you know that we will have the third session, which will take place in September during our AMEC conference in St. Petersburg. But today, after this session and after discussion of the paper that will be presented by Denis, we are going to have some concluding remarks. So we will award the students in different categories, and we will exchange feedback. So we are really very interested in your evaluation of new format of the summer school, whether you have succeeded and would you like to continue in this way next chapters. So that in that sense, so just to announce while we are waiting for participants, but so now I will give the screen to Denis. He will have about 1 hour, and then we will have some time for discussion. So Denis, the screen is yours.
Thanks, Elena. So hopefully you can see that screen. This paper is something that some of you have already seen. Some of you have even participated in writing it. We started this paper quite a while ago, and now it's on its second revision at the European Journal of Operations Research. Please feel free to interrupt me with questions at any time. I don't have a problem with that. And if I'm not clear, definitely ask me to be clearer. So this paper is about a sports economics topic related to specific unobservability of player contracts in European football. So if you want to think about a labor economics topic, a typical kind of labor economics study would explain a player compensation or worker compensation based on attributes of the worker, their age, their education, their experience, what kind of industry they work in, things like that. But to be able to do that, you have to know how much money they earn. Well, in the case of football, we have almost no information on how much players earn. American sports, you can get American football players' salaries, you can get baseball players' salaries, and hockey players' salaries, and basketball players' salaries, and you can get the salaries of players in Major League Soccer, the American Premier Soccer Division. But if you want to study player compensation in Europe, it's not essentially possible because we don't have the information on the value of the contracts. Now, that's not 100% true. There is information on contracts for players in Serie A in Italy, but that's fairly limited. But for the Premier League in England or the Bundesliga in Germany or anywhere else, it's not available. And so if you want to study this, you have to come up with some alternative measure of player value. And the common values are things produced by an organization called Transfermarkt, where they produce values, and I'll talk about how they produce those values in a little bit. And then a magazine in Germany specifically about the Bundesliga called Kicker also makes an estimation and evaluation of what player contracts or player salaries might be, but those are all basically just guesses. These guesses are widely used in the literature, and so I've just given you a bunch of papers there that have used one or the other of these measures as the value of the player, as a way of explaining or evaluating what determines compensation in professional football. These values also take on a real world sort of practical importance, because players and clubs, when they go to negotiate a contract, new information, new salary compensation, or when two clubs negotiate about transferring one player from the location to another, these values produced by Transfermarkt and Kicker often come into the negotiations. So a player will say, here's what my transfer market value is. So I think that you should be paying me more because of that value. And of course, the clubs can take that value and say, well, here's your value according to transfer market, and this is what we think we should pay you. So these things are actually used in contract negotiations. So that raises the question about whether these are reliable measures of the value of players. And what we have in sports economics is a big dispute. On one side is a man by the name of Stefan Szymanski, who says, no, these aren't very reliable. They're not actual values of what players produce for their clubs. And on the other hand, you have Bernd Frick, who says, yes, they're quite reliable. And I'll give you some evidence that Frick produces for his position later on. Szymanski's position is really more of a theoretical one that basically says value is determined by the interaction of supply and demand, not by a bunch of people writing down guesses on a piece of paper and then somebody else aggregating those guesses into a number. And so those can't possibly be reliable. So what are these values? I've already sort of given that away. Basically, what you have is a situation where many individuals make an assessment of a player value, and they report this assessment online to the organization Transfermarkt. People at the organization then take those assessments and aggregate them in some way. It's clear that they don't just average them. They do explicitly say that they evaluate them for reliability. So has this person provided guesses before? Do they seem way out of line from the other guesses that people are making? And so they basically assign a weight, and the weight may be 0 to different assessments of the value of the players. So that's what these are. What I want to do is just give you a little bit of history about why there's interest in this. And it goes back to Galton in 1907 came up with this notion. He called it the voice of the people. He was at the West of England Fat Stock and Poultry Exhibition, where 800 people wrote down on a piece of paper the pounds, the amount of wheat in the amount of meat in weight produced if you were to butcher an ox and dress it all out for sale. So there's an ox standing in a stall. People come by, they look at the ox, and they decide how many pounds of meat will be produced when that ox is prepared for the meat to be sold. And there's 800 of these guesses, as I've said, and Galton goes to the judges of this and asks for the papers. And when he gets the papers, out of the 800 pieces of paper, 787 of them are legible. So meaning that the paper, the writing on the paper was not smudged, and he could actually figure out what the number was. The median guess was 1,207 pounds, and the actual weight was 1,198 pounds. So from this, Galton proposed this voice of the people was a good way at settling on the truth. So you get a lot of guesses. And in this case, it was guesses from people who probably had some experience in the evaluation. You get all those people to make a guess, and then you use that information as a way of assessing what the true value might be. Now, this idea has come to be known the wisdom of crowds, and that's where the title comes from of our paper. The guesses that Galton received were not symmetric around the mean. There were a lot more over guesses than there were under guesses. Now, since that time, the wisdom of crowds, this approach has been used and been the subject of a great deal of research. There's a book by James Surowiecki called The Wisdom of Crowds, and he gives a really interesting example that I'm just going to tell you about because I think this is really quite fascinating. A submarine went down to the bottom of the ocean, and they didn't know where it was. The people looking for it didn't know where to look. So they went to a variety of individuals, submarine captains, ocean salvage experts, weather individuals, a variety of people, and they all used different pieces of information, different sort of inferential approaches to make guesses about where it was. And then those guesses were compiled in a way that led to a location. That location was 100 meters from where the submarine actually was found. This is the idea of using broad amounts of information from a lot of different individuals to get at the truth, even when the truth is not previously known. So, you could say, have a jar full of candies and have people guess how many candies are in there. You know what the truth is in advance. You know how many candies are already there. They didn't know where the submarine was, so they couldn't sort of fudge the results by finding how to make it close. They came up with a result, and then they searched there and found the submarine. So the wisdom of crowds has been the subject of a great deal of research. And so the question that many people focus on is, what makes this crowd assessment a wise assessment? What makes it good? And in this context, people have focused on the characteristics of the individuals making the assessment and what kind of knowledge and information and motivation those individuals have when they're making their assessment. Another avenue of research is, what are the characteristics of the assessments? And so in this regard, the question is about how widespread, what is the spread in the assessments, and does the truth fall within the assessment? So think about it like this. If the truth is 5 and I solicit guesses, and everyone guesses a number between 10 and 50, then the result of using those guesses isn't going to get me very close to 5. But if the guesses are from 0 to 10 and the truth is 5, then those guesses are going to get me close no matter how I combine them. are going to move me closer to the truth because the truth is within the set of guesses. So how widespread are the guesses, and does the truth fall within the guesses? The organization of this paper is going to be the following. The first part is going to focus on what is a good or a wise crowd in theory. And then the second part is going to be the empirical part about the transfer market. And so that's a good or wise crowd in practice. So generally speaking, the approach that people have taken to determining whether a crowd-sourced guess is good or not is whether or not it's the forecast is unbiased and whether it has the minimum mean square error or the mean absolute error is minimized. So, or actually, I should rephrase that. We would think about a forecast as being good if it's unbiased and if it has the smallest variance. In the literature, however, what people have done, and here's two articles that have done this, is they've ignored the unbiased portion of this notion to focus on minimizing the mean squared error. So these are two papers that are closely related. They focus on minimizing the mean squared error to find the optimal weights. What are the best weights to put on each of the individual guesses to get the smallest possible mean square error? And then they also ask the question a little bit of, should the crowd be selected in some way? And by selected, what I mean and what they mean in the literature is, do you just take any people at random, or do you take people who have some specialized knowledge? Presumably, experts should be able to give you a better answer than just picking people out of a survey on the street corner. And so what they want to do is address that kind of a question. So the minimum mean squared error could still be biased. And the question is whether this bias is upward or downward. So what I want to do is hopefully convince you that having a guess that has a very small variance is not sufficient, because you want to know if that very small variance includes the actual true value. So think about it like this. Suppose that the truth is 5, and we have a very small variance that of guesses, and that variance is from 7 to 9. Okay, so if you then go into your contract negotiations, to bring it back to the transfer market, and you use a value between 7 and 9, but the truth is 5, then one side is either overpaying or being underpaid. Right? The 5 is the truth. It doesn't matter if the true value is lower than that guess, that minimum mean squared error, if it doesn't include the true value. So I'm going to build this theoretical model and show you some important implications from it. And this isn't a model that I've really created. I've adapted it a little bit, but it comes from those two papers that I showed you before. So let's suppose that there is an individual I who makes a forecast of the true value of player P. So there are lots of individuals, all of whom are going to make a guess of the true value of player P. The true value is going to be V. So that's the player's true value. And then there's going to be two additional components. There's going to be a completely random component, EIP, so the individual error of person I on player P. And there's going to be I's bias about player P. What do I mean by bias? So suppose that you absolutely hate, for some reason, some specific player. So no matter what the player does, you're always going to undervalue that person. Or suppose you absolutely love that player, or you love the team that the player is on, so that you overvalue that player. You have some bias in your view of the player, either because of the player as a person, the team the player plays on, or whatever. It also gets built into your guess about the player's value. Now, people make these guesses and submit them. And then there's some mechanism for taking those individual guesses and turning them into the group forecast. And I'm going to say that this mechanism is G of S. So all of these individual guesses get put into this mechanism to form a guess. And for simplicity's sake, I'm going to say it's the weighted average of the guesses. Okay, it doesn't have to be. It could be the median, could be the mode, could be, any number of things could be used as this function. I'm going to say that the function is a weighted average. Now, this is unbiased if the expected value of this weighted average is the true value. When would it be unbiased? Well, those W's are weights, how much influence we put on each of those individuals. So they have to be between 0 and 1, and they have to add up to 1. Okay, so we have that. But then we have that the weights and the bias parameters and the weights and the random error terms have to be uncorrelated. The expectation of the interaction of the weights with the bias terms and the random error terms is 0. Okay, so in this case, what we're saying is that that's an error. It's not that the expectation of the weighted average of the guesses is 0. It's the expectation of the deviance from the truth is 0. I'm sorry, that's a typo. And what this boils down to, simply speaking, is that the weights and the signals have to be uncorrelated. Okay, the weights and the signals are the truth plus this, have to be uncorrelated. But I already told you that the transfer market staff and anybody else who uses wisdom of crowds kinds of approaches has to decide and does decide how much influence to put on each of the different predictions. And they do so by saying, this forecast comes from somebody we've seen before and they have been generally accurate, so we'll put more weight on that person. And here's a person we've never seen before. We don't know whether their forecast is good or not, so we're not going to put as much weight on them. This person is an expert. We're going to put a lot of weight on that person's guesses. So they explicitly select weights based on previous information about the accuracy of the forecasts, or other issues. So that might not even be the accuracy of the forecast, it might be the frequency of guesses or something like that. So by definition, these are not 0, which means that the forecast that comes out of that previous equation is by definition biased, that the expectation of the weighted average of the signals is not the true value. So transfer market values are biased as guesses of the true value of the player. Nonetheless, they can still be accurate, right? They can be biased, not give you the true value on average, but still be really close in terms of the forecast and getting narrow band of the guess. So here's the mean square error. Basically, I've just taken this expression and multiplied it all out. As you look at this, we're going, if it's unbiased, if we have that the deltas and the epsilons are not correlated to the weights, then terms like this drop out. This would drop out because this is correlation of my guess with your guess. We're going to assume that that's 0. Okay. So with that, you're just left with this first term and that term, which is this. And writing that all out and simplifying, you come up with this. So if the guess is unbiased, then the forecast variance looks like this, and we can minimize that by choosing the weights. Okay. And if we do that and impose the condition that the weights add to 1, we can get, in the general case with lots of individuals, this expression that's probably not terribly intuitive or easy to understand. So let's suppose we have the 2-person case. Only 2 people are making forecasts. What do you see here? This is individual I, and that is individual J. The only place that individual I's variance of their forecast shows up is in the denominator of this optimal weight, which means if your forecast variance is large, this ratio is small, and you should have lower weight put on your guesses. And if your forecast variance is small, you should have high getting closer to 1. And think about this as being 0. There's no variance in your forecast. Then this is just 1. You should get all of the weight. So the variance of individuals' own bias and random error term, that's what the sigma squareds are. The variance in their random components of their guesses. It only appears in the denominator, so the greater the variance of an individual's guesses, the smaller the weight that individual's forecasts should get. Now, I want to point out something, and this is a problem with the theory and translating that theory into practice. The variance here that is going in this expression is the variance of individual I's predictions of the value of player P, of the same player. It's very possible that the individual has never valued this player more than once. So we don't really have a good measure of variance in that case for anybody. So the problem is, in all of this sort of optimizing, is how do we know which forecasts have the greatest variance when we don't have sufficient number of forecasts of the value of an individual player? Now, it is, of course, possible to make variances based on forecast of multiple players. Well, but that's just kind of a nonsense number, right? Because my variance in the forecast of all players would include my bias parameter towards Messi and my bias parameter towards Ronaldo and my bias parameter towards Neymar and so on. And all of those things are affecting the variance here. But this weight is supposed to be about how much influence my guess is in determining the value of a specific individual player. So it can't be based on information about my guesses about players other than this player. So what people have done is empirically tried to evaluate the forecasts, and that's what we're going to do next. So let me summarize. You're going to minimize the forecast variance. Imposing unbiasedness of forecast means there's no correlation across individual responses, and weights have to be independent of individual responses. Optimal weights would be inversely related to the variance of an individual's forecast on a specific player. The key thing here is that the weights have to be independent of individual responses, and that clearly is not the case. So that suggests that transfer market and other values created using wisdom of crowds are going to be biased in some way. So what are we going to do? First, I told you that we're going to have a different notion of what it means to be a good or a wise forecast. Bernd Frick and Katrina Prockel, I think Katrina, in 2017 published a paper, and their argument basically was the following. Transfer market values exist for players in Major League Soccer in the United States where salaries are available. What we want to know is whether transfer market values of players are a good way of forecasting or representing, proxying salaries of players in the Bundesliga, in the English Premier League, in La Liga, wherever. And so what we want to do is infer from the relationship between transfer market values of players in Major League Soccer and the salaries of those players in Major League Soccer, infer the accuracy of the proxies for the leagues where we don't have salaries. So the first thing they do is correlations between the two transfer values and salaries, and it's the log of those values, and they get a value of 0.7. So they're really highly correlated. And if we run a regression that explains the salary of the players with a certain set of explanatory variables, and then we use that same set of explanatory variables to explain the transfer market values, almost all of those things are significant, statistically significant, and of the correct signs in both regressions. Consequently, Frick and Prockel conclude, yeah, we can use the transfer values from transfer market as a proxy for salary. Our motivation is a little bit different, and that is that we actually know the transfer value, so how much was paid by one club to another club to acquire the contract of a specific player. So we want to assess whether transfer market's guess and the actual value that was paid are related. How closely related are they? And if they're closely related, in what way? And can we reasonably use the transfer market value as a prediction or as a guess of the fee that will be paid for a player? Now, there's a previous studies have done precisely this sort of thing, and so there's a bunch of them. And Bernd Frick has a 2007 review of much of that literature. From now on, I'm going to call the actual money that changes hands between clubs the fee. And value will refer to the amount that was produced by the guesses from Transfermarkt. So here's our research question. Are these crowdsourced values good predictors of actual transfer values, or are the crowdsourced values predictors of the fee, good predictors of the fee? We define good not simply as highly correlated or as minimum variance, but as unbiased. So we're going to think of this in a way similar to the efficient markets hypothesis. So what does that say? In the efficient markets hypothesis from finance, basically you have this notion that stock prices reflect all available information at a point in time. And so there is no way that you can improve on your prediction of the value because the actual value already accounts correctly for all available information. So that leads to the prediction that, or the hypothesis that only surprises, new pieces of information can produce changes in stock market or stock price, stock prices. So our question for this circumstance is, what might such information be? What would be readily available information that we could assess for whether or not it helps improve the prediction of the actual transfer fee over what Transfermarkt says? So individual performance. It's easy to go online and get information on the number of goals and the number of assists and red cards and yellow cards and corner kicks and whatever you want to think of. You can get an enormous amount of information about players' individual performance. You can also get information on things like the player's age, the position they play, the league they're in, the club they play for. All of that stuff is easily available. It's also not terribly difficult to get other crowdsourced evaluations. And so we have and use in this, this project information from the FIFA video game for soccer. They have a crowdsourcing of evaluations of players. Sorry. They have evaluations of players, but not only just do they have evaluations of players, but they have evaluations of players on numerous different performance or skills or attributes of the players, which we will also use. And also how much time is left on the contract. So one can easily think that a player that has a lot of time left on their contract would receive a higher transfer fee. There would be a higher transfer fee for such a player than there would be for a player with very little time left on their contract. Why? Well, if a player has little time left on their contract, that means that when the contract expires, they can sell their services to whomever they want without a fee being paid. And anybody who might want to acquire that player would think to themselves, well, I'm only going to get this player for a very short time under their current contract, so I don't want to pay a lot to acquire them when they could leave quite quickly after the fact. So here's the regression equation that we're going to estimate. Here's the first is the actual amount of money paid by one club to the other. This is the transfer market guess of the value of that player. And this is other explanatory variables like goals and assists and position, time left on contract, and so on. The null hypothesis is that A0 and all of the B's are equal to 0. What would that say? That the phi is just proportional to the transfer value. So if the transfer value is 100, the phi might be 90, the phi might be 110, but there is some simple transformation between the two. Now, if it is in fact the case that the phi is 100 and the transfer value is 90, then the actual phi is greater than the transfer value. That would be a player that the transfer market undervalued. So there could be this simple proportionality and players be undervalued or overvalued by the transfer market, even if all of this stuff is 0. Alternatively, A1 could be 1 and all of these other things be 0. In that case, what do we know? In that case, then the transfer market gives you exactly, on average, the true value of the fee that is actually paid. So if we reject the null hypothesis, what that means is that transfer values are a biased estimator of the true fee. So if I take the expectation of this expression, for the expectation here to just be equal to the transfer value, A0, all of the B's have to be 0, and this has to be 1. But we're rejecting it only if this is not 0 or this is not 0. And we're going to interpret or infer what we can about A1 after we get the estimation done. So here's the data. We're going to have the transfer market values that come from transfermarkt.de. We have their observed transfer fees, so how much the player actually was sold for. We have 25 individual skills and attributes plus an overall rating from the EA Sports FIFA video game ratings. And we have information on player performance and characteristics. So we've got goals per 1,000 minutes, assists per 1,000 minutes, age, whether or not they're in a top league. A top league would be the English Premier League, the Bundesliga, Ligue 1 in France, Serie A in Italy, and La Liga in Spain. Everything else is not a top league. And then we also have time left on their current contract. And the data covers the period from 1996 to 2016. Now, I want to emphasize something before I go on to the next slide to show you descriptive statistics. That is, players in our data could be playing at the top level in the first division club in Germany or Spain, or they could be playing in a first division club in Poland or Russia, or they could be playing in a second or third division club or a junior league somewhere and still be transferred. So in our non-top leagues, we have first divisions of teams of leagues that are not those 5 I indicated, but we also have lower level, lower divisions. So the second division in England would be a not top league. Okay, so we have players like that. And as you'll see from the next slide, we have players that range from 17 years old to 36 years old. This young age of players is indicating, in fact, that we have players that are in lower level divisions, in training divisions, and so on. And you see the fees paid. Notice this is the actual fee in real British pounds in thousands. So this would be I think this is Neymar for 96 million pounds transfer fee. Here, actual fee paid. Here's the guesses of player value. The highest one that they came up with in the transfer market guesses was only 62 million. The smallest actual fee paid, 0.23 thousands. The smallest transfer market value guess, 24,000. So a lot of variation there. We have whether the player was on their country's national team, the number of matches that they played, and as I said, goals per 1,000 minutes, assists per 1,000 minutes, and position. We don't have goaltenders in the data. This is only quote unquote outfielders, so defenders, midfielders, and forwards or strikers. And then time remaining on the contract. You notice time remaining on the contract is less than a third of our sample. So we're going to do estimations both including that variable and not including that variable for precisely the reason that it loses us a lot of observations when we include it. And then here's the top league, and as you see, about 67% of our data set is players from the top leagues. Now, we also have information that I'm not going to use in this talk at all about the club that the player started from, the club they ended up on, the league that they were in, the league that they ended up in, the country that they were in, the country they ended up in, and so on. So we have a lot of information about the directions of sales and so on. I'm not going to emphasize that in anything I talk about. So here's our first set of regressions. There's the transfer market estimate. And what do you see? The coefficient is bigger than 1, which means that the value of the transfer market estimate, excuse me, is too small. And you might say, well, yeah, that's pretty close to 1. Is it statistically different from 1? And the answer is, and that's what this row says, yes, it is statistically different from 1 in each of those cases. So if all we have is the transfer market value, oops, that was not good. If all we have is the transfer market value and the an intercept term, this says the transfer market value is an underestimate of the true fee in our full sample. Then we include other explanatory variables. And we see that the number of matches the player played, their goals per 1,000 minutes, their assists per 1,000 minutes, their age and their age squared. Many things are statistically significant, which means that the transfer market guess does not include that information correctly. If it included that information correctly or at all, it could be either one, then these should not be statistically significant. The transfer market estimate value is a biased guess of the true value. And in this case, it tends to be an underestimate. Now, here we've incorporated the time left on the contract, and what you see is that the transfer market value actually becomes an even greater underestimate of the true value than it was before, and still statistically significant, and that the time left on the contract is statistically significant. And I don't have the scale here, but 1 asterisk is the 5% level, 3 is the 100th percent level, so 0.00 1. Yeah. So 0.05, 2 stars is 0.01, and 3 stars is 0.001. So this is pretty strongly significant. These are no longer significant. So you might say, so yes, there is bias, but that bias is coming from perhaps not having the time left on the contract. And I would say, yeah, maybe, except if you do a joint hypothesis test on all of these other variables, so the null is this is 0, this is 0, this is 0, this is 0, and so on, you reject that null easily. So they are jointly significant even though they are individually not. So they still are helping to improve the prediction of the actual fee paid, even though they're not individually statistically significant. Okay, so extensions and robustness. I see I've got about 5 minutes. I thought I was going to go much quicker than this. Extensions and robustness. We did the time remaining. It reduces the sample. And this is what I just said. One of the criticisms that we got from the referees was that maybe there was a problem, because if you notice, the coefficient on assists per 1,000 minutes was negative. That would say that if you were getting more assists, that your value was lower. And that doesn't make any sense. So we explained the crowdsource value with all those same coefficients. And here's what happens. In explaining the transfer market guess, assists is positive and statistically significant. The evaluators are putting heavy weight on the value of assists. And what the real market value is saying is, yeah, you know what? The transfer market guess has effectively overvalued assists. And that's why you have that negative coefficient when the transfer market value and the assists are together. That's why you have the negative sign on assists. That the transfer market value is putting too much emphasis on assists. We made regressions with all 25 of those player skills from the FIFA evaluation, with and without the time remaining on the contract. In every model, we reject the null that the coefficients are all 0. So all of that information, if we were to put it in, would help us to improve our prediction of the actual fee over the value made or guessed by the transfer market. We split it out into top versus other leagues, and top leagues and other leagues, it doesn't matter whether we look only at those top 5 or we look at all leagues, it's giving us the same conclusion that the guesses are not accurate. The last thing I'm going to talk to you about in 2 minutes worth of time roughly is quantile regression. Quantile regression is less influenced by outliers. It allows coefficient heterogeneity. And how it differs from, so those are advantages to it over ordinary least squares, which is what we've done. The advantage to it, or the way to think about it, is if you did an ordinary least squares regression, it fits the regression line through the mean of the day. So that's just one of the characteristics of OLS, is that the average of all of the explanatory variables and the average of the outcome variable are a data point on the fitted line. With quantile regression, what you're going to do is fit a line, or you're going to fit a line that's going to put a specific percentage of the data set of the observations above and below the line. So what you're looking at is different relationships depending on whether you're thinking about many of the observations being above the line or few of the observations being above the line. If you had normally distributed dependent variable, then the median regression, or the 50th percentile regression in OLS, would be essentially the same because the mean and the median of the normal distribution are the same thing. So here's what happens. If we do it at the 10th percentile, and this is for the full sample, I also have similar slides for the other, the top and the lesser leagues. What do you see here? The coefficient on transfer market fee, the transfer market value, is small, is below 1. Whereas if you look at the high end, large values of the transfer market value, or transfer market fee rather, the relationship is bigger than 1. The coefficient on the transfer value variable is bigger than 1. So low values, what does that say? If the coefficient is less than 1 multiplied by the guess, that gives you a smaller number, right? So the transfer market guesses are too big. They overvalue players at the low end and they undervalue players at the high end. The guess is too small at the high end, too large at the low end. And these are all statistically different from 0, basically from about the 45th percentile up through the 90th percentile for bigger, and about the 30th percentile down for smaller. So conclusions. Transfer market values, if they're thought of as estimates of the true values, they're biased. They're not. We can improve upon our guesses of the true values by including readily information like player performance and age. Player performance and other characteristics are significant determinants of fees. The value substantially underestimates actual fees at the high end and overestimates them at the low end, and this is true in top and lesser leagues. But in the lesser leagues, there isn't really any undervaluation at the high end, largely because there aren't very many players that would be at the high end that are in the lesser leagues. And with that, I am done. 1 minute too long, sorry.
Dennis, thank you very much. So now we have opportunity to give feedback, comments. Any comments, questions are very welcome.
Well, I probably, I don't know whether this is possible, but do you think that the results can be somehow transferred to non-sports policy related to salaries, like in industries where salaries are competitive, and we can somehow measure the performance of people?
Yeah, well, I guess there's 2 things that I would ask about that in my response. And the first is, what would we think of as the outside guess of what the worker is worth as a comparison? And second, yeah, I think you could analyze what determines the contract value of other laborers. So if you had the value of the contracts of lawyers or doctors, or so you know the individual's contracts, or say singers or actors or something, where you can get that information about an individual. Yeah, I think you could do similar sorts of things but without having that independent sort of crowdsourced guess, I'm not sure what how you would make any sort of transference of the approach.
Thank you.
There is Ricardo and then me, I think. Ricardo.
Well, what I want to ask is in line with your question in the chat, basically. That is, for what I have understood, at least, the transfer market value should reflect the expected value of a player. I buy a player in August, I expect him to play in some way during the next tournament.
Season.
But what we observe in the reality, in the data, is the realized value of the player. So we can think the transfer market as a risk investment. With some probability, the player will play good. With some probability, the player will play bad. My concern is that we do not observe both this realization, but we do not observe both these possibilities, so all the lottery, but we do observe only the realization, that is how the player actually play in the next tournament, how this can influence your result.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not sure if this is the same as what Paula's question is, but think about it like this. You have a player that this independent organization has produced a guess of the value of that player. And that guess is updated roughly twice a year or so. So their guesses are being changed as they observe performance, presumably taking that performance into account. And if a player is undervalued at some particular time and they're playing really well, then presumably that value would be raised. The guess about that person's value, if they were to be sold from one club to another, would be higher. So in that respect, yes, you're right that uncertainty that is revealed after the player performs is omitted from our analysis, because what we're looking at is what the guess was and what the player sold for, not what he actually did produce after the fact. Now, and sort of also related to this, Peter and I and is it Sophia our co-author, Peter? I think Sophia Pocklina is our co-author. Yes. We're looking at the messages that are sent and how much influence those messages sent have on the guesses that are made. So if you get a bunch of messages coming in that says this player is overvalued and you should reduce his value, how much influence does that actually have on the guess? So we're thinking about that, and presumably those guesses are being adjusted based on observed performance. But what we have here is, here's the guess on the day the sale was made, and here's the value of the sale. We don't have any information about post-sale performance in this analysis. Only on performance up to the point of the sale.
Thank you, Dennis.
I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. There is also a question and or comment from Victor. Victor, can you ask or?
Yeah.
Victor
Actually,
is inspired.
Yes, I'm extremely inspired by your presentation. Thank you so much for it. Unfortunately, I missed like first 10 or 15 minutes of this presentation. I've just actually I came out with several ideas. But what I wanted to know is that is this data somehow available in a stat or SPSS format or Excel format, Transfermarkt data? And does it include information about Russian Premier League as well, and how many leagues or how many players, professional players are there? So could you please tell a few words about this data set?
Sure. Peter answered the question basically. Yes, it's available, but it needs to be scraped. It's not. Transfermarkt is a for-profit entity, and they don't want to sell their data, and so they make it difficult to get. But it is available. It includes the Russian Premier League. It includes basically every player that has a professional contract. So right down to players that are just at the junior level performing for, say, the U17, or well, probably not the U17, but the U20 club for Bayern Munich. Their players are in there. And it includes players from Latin America and Asia. It's, as you get to players from less widely followed leagues, you would think that the valuations are weaker simply because fewer people know anything about those players and have seen those players play. The number of evaluations would be smaller, but it's there for many, many, many players and pretty much every league.
And is it possible to know, like, to see, for instance, like, is there information about their salaries and also their belonging to different national teams as available, or it should be done manually, for instance?
Salaries, the whole point of this, and this is what you missed at the beginning, is that salaries are not available, and so the usage of this transfer market value as a proxy for salary is contentious. One of the papers I mentioned was by Bernd Frick and a co-author, where they looked at Major League Soccer, where salaries in the US, where salaries are available, and the transfer market value, to show that they're highly correlated. The things that predict one predict the other, and so on. And so that's why my argument, or our argument, is that it's not just are they correlated, but how accurate are they? Because if I go into my salary negotiation and I have this number that under predicts my value by 25%, and that's the basis for my salary negotiation, I'm not going to be, I'm not going to be correctly compensated, appropriately compensated. So yeah, that's precisely the problem. But other information, performance information, is there, but not, but it's just things like number of goals and things like that. It's not more evaluation of the skills the player has that we got from this FIFA video game. And there's other similar things you might be aware of. I think it's called Football Manager. That's also a computerized game where you pick your lineup. That has evaluation of the players as well, based on their skills.
Constantly.
What was
So
that?
Yes, thank you so much for such detailed answer.
You're welcome.
And this, yeah, it's really inspiring. Yeah, thank you.
Good, thank you.
So thank you, Victor and Dennis.